You're crawling through mud-slick tunnels beneath Temple Gate when you hear it, singing that echoes off stone walls like a hymn sung underwater. The voices layer and harmonize in something that might be worship or might be threat. You can't tell which, and that uncertainty makes your hands shake as you try to keep the camera steady. Then you see the figure standing in the passage ahead, backlit by torchlight, wearing a dress caked in filth, and they turn to look at you with eyes that have seen God and decided God was wrong. This is Val, former chief deacon of a doomsday cult, current prophet of the heretics, and a person whose fractured psychology reveals what happens when religious trauma doesn't just break you, but reshapes you into something that perpetuates the very horrors you fled. Val didn't escape Sullivan Noth's testament of the new Ezekiel. Val became a different version of it, preaching liberation while committing the same violations, rejecting a false prophet while becoming one, and searching for authentic identity in the worst possible place, at the center of another cult, this one built from Val's own unhealed wounds and visions that might have been divine communication, or might have been nothing more than corporate-sponsored psychosis, broadcast through radio towers hidden in the mountains. Tonight we're doing a complete psychological analysis of Val from Outlast 2. We're not just cataloging the horror of the heretics or listing the crimes committed in those mud-covered minds. We're going deep into the architecture of a fractured identity, examining how religious indoctrination shapes personality, how institutional abuse creates the conditions for rebellion that simply replicates the original violence, and how someone can simultaneously reject and embody the faith that formed them. This is going to be thorough and unflinching because Val deserves more than dismissal as just another Outlast antagonist. Their story is a case study in how cults fracture personalities, how trauma creates leaders who perpetuate cycles of abuse, and how the search for authentic identity under oppressive belief systems can twist into something unrecognizable. Settle in, get comfortable. We're going to take our time with this because understanding Val means understanding the testament of the new Ezekiel, the psychology of cult defection, and the terrible things that happen when damaged people find new gods to serve. Let's begin where all stories of religious trauma begin, in the indoctrination that shapes a life before that life has the tools to resist. The making of a Deacon Val didn't start as a heretic. The documents scattered throughout Outlast 2 make this clear. Val was once Sullivan Noth's chief deacon, a high-ranking position within the testament of the new Ezekiel that suggested complete devotion to the prophet's vision. To understand how someone rises to that position, we need to understand how the testament functions as a totalizing system that colonizes every aspect of a person's consciousness. The testament of the new Ezekiel operates like many real-world doomsday cults, isolated from outside influence, ruled by a charismatic leader who claims direct communication with the divine, and organized around the belief that they alone possess salvific knowledge while the rest of the world spirals toward destruction. Sullivan Noth positioned himself as God's chosen prophet, the only person capable of interpreting the divine will and guiding his followers toward survival of the approaching apocalypse. This structure creates absolute dependency. When one person controls access to salvation, questioning that person becomes equivalent to damning yourself. Val would have been raised in this system, or converted young enough that the Testament's worldview became the foundation of their entire understanding of reality. The cult didn't just tell Val what to believe, it told Val who to be, how to think, what to feel, and what their life meant. This kind of comprehensive indoctrination doesn't create beliefs that can be easily discarded. It creates a personality structure where the cult's doctrines become inseparable from the self. As chief deacon, Val would have been responsible for administering religious instruction, performing rituals, and serving as an intermediary between Noth and the congregation. This position required demonstrating exceptional faith, unwavering loyalty, and the ability to enforce the prophet's will even when that will demanded terrible things. The role wasn't just administrative, it was performative. Val had to embody the Testament's values, had to be a living example of what devotion looked like, had to project absolute certainty even when confronted with the cognitive dissonance that comes from serving a God of love through acts of violence. The psychological weight of this position cannot be overstated. As chief deacon, Val occupied a liminal space, neither the absolute authority of the prophet nor the powerlessness of ordinary followers, but something in between. This created a unique vulnerability. Val had enough proximity to power to see the mechanisms behind Noth's authority, enough responsibility to carry out orders that revealed the ugliness beneath the theological justifications, but not enough autonomy to question or resist without risking everything. Documents found in the game reveal that Val was given responsibility for Temple Gate's sick children, serving as their foster parent. This role adds crucial context to Val's psychological formation. The Testament's approach to illness was filtered through their apocalyptic theology. Sickness was evidence of sin, weakness, or demonic influence. Children who fell ill weren't just unfortunate, they were marked, tainted, potential vectors for the corruption Noth preached against. Yet Val was assigned to care for them, creating an impossible emotional bind. How do you nurture children you've been taught to view with suspicion? How do you maintain the detachment your faith demands while performing the intimate labor of caretaking? Val's journals, which Blake discovers scattered throughout Temple Gate, reveal someone who genuinely sympathized with these children. This sympathy is crucial. It suggests that beneath the layers of indoctrination, Val retained the capacity for compassion, for seeing suffering as something to alleviate rather than something deserved. But the Testament didn't allow for that compassion to flourish. Instead, Noth's pragmatic theology demanded that these children be killed, not healed, not quarantined, not tended with mercy, killed because their continued existence posed a threat to the community's spiritual purity. And Val, as chief deacon, was forced to carry out these executions. The psychological impact of being made to kill children you care for is catastrophic. It creates a fracture in the psyche that can never fully heal. The part of you that feels compassion goes to war with the part that has been conditioned to obey, and the result is profound dissociation. Val couldn't reconcile these actions with any understanding of themselves as a good person, as a faithful servant, as someone worthy of love or salvation. The cognitive dissonance was unbearable. This is where the dreams started. The dreams that changed everything. Val's journals describe vivid nocturnal visions that began after the killing of Temple Gate's children. These weren't ordinary nightmares. They were elaborate, consistent, and shared among multiple members of the community. The content of these dreams centered on the Testament's monstrous bloodshed, forcing dreamers to confront the violence they'd normalized during waking hours. Val wrote, "Our sins find us in our dreams," a recognition that the unconscious mind was rejecting what conscious faith demanded they accept. From a psychological perspective, these dreams represent the psyche's attempt at self-preservation. When waking reality becomes too unbearable to process directly, the unconscious creates spaces where truth can be acknowledged. Val's dreams weren't random. They were the parts of Val's personality that retained moral sensitivity, screaming against the atrocities being committed in God's name. But here's where things get complicated. because these dreams weren't just psychological phenomena. The game strongly suggests they were connected to the Murkoff Corporation's experiments, with radio towers broadcasting signals that induced hallucinations and psychotic breaks in Temple Gate's population. The technology from Mount Massive Asylum's Project Walrider had evolved, and Temple Gate was another testing ground. The dreams Val and others experienced were partially induced, manipulated, weaponized by forces the cultists couldn't comprehend. This creates a fascinating layer of ambiguity, where Val's visions genuine mystical experiences, technological manipulation, psychotic breaks under extreme stress, or some combination of all three. The answer matters less than what Val did with these experiences, because regardless of their origin, Val interpreted these dreams as divine communication, not from Noth's God, but from something else, something the Testament called the enemy, something that would come to be understood as the Antichrist, the spider-eyed lamb, the entity Noth feared above all else. Val's journals reveal that these dreams didn't isolate her, they connected her to others having similar experiences. Members of the Testament began meeting in secret in the abandoned mines near Temple Gate to discuss what they were seeing. These gatherings were extraordinary acts of rebellion in a system where private assembly outside official worship was forbidden. They represented the formation of a counter-community, a shadow congregation united not by Noth's doctrine, but by shared trauma and shared visions. The psychology of this moment is crucial. Val and the future heretics were experiencing what cult researchers call cognitive opening, a crack in the totalizing worldview that allows alternative interpretations to enter. For people raised in closed systems, this opening usually comes through exposure to outside information that contradicts the cult's teachings. But Val's opening came from within, from experiences so intense that they couldn't be dismissed or explained away by existing doctrine. The Testament taught that dreams could be messages from God, that visions carried divine authority, that spiritual experiences validated truth claims. Noth himself claimed to receive revelations this way. So when Val and others began having dreams that contradicted Noth's teachings, they were left with an impossible choice: dismiss their own spiritual experiences and maintain loyalty to the prophet, or trust their visions and recognize that Noth might be wrong. Val chose the visions. This choice wasn't made lightly or quickly. Val's position as chief deacon meant she had everything to lose: status, purpose, community, the entire framework of meaning that had structured her existence. Defecting from the Testament meant admitting that the children she'd killed had died for nothing, that the faith she'd devoted herself to was a lie, that the God she'd served either didn't exist or had been grotesquely misrepresented by a false prophet. The psychological pain of this realization cannot be overstated. It wasn't just losing faith. It was recognizing that faith had been used as a weapon against her and others, that devotion had been exploited, that everything Val thought was sacred was actually profane. This kind of epistemic collapse, where your entire understanding of reality proves false, creates trauma that rivals physical violence. Some cult defectors describe it as a kind of death. The person you were dies, and you have to construct a new self from the wreckage. But Val didn't just defect. Val became a prophet herself, leading a new movement built on the very visions the Testament condemned. This transformation from devoted deacon to heretic leader reveals something crucial about Val's psychology. The need for structure, for certainty, for divine guidance didn't disappear when faith in Noth collapsed. Instead, it transferred. Val found a new God to serve, and in doing so replicated many of the same dynamics that had defined life under Noth's rule. The birth of the heretics. The heretics Val led weren't just disappointed former cultists. They were people who had experienced the same cognitive opening, the same unbearable dreams, the same recognition that the Testament's theology was built on violence disguised as virtue. But their response to this recognition reveals how difficult it is to escape the psychological patterns that cults instill. Val sent Snoth a letter explaining the departure. The document represents a remarkable act of defiance, a direct confrontation with the prophet's authority, naming the Testament's violence and explicitly rejecting Noth's claim to divine guidance. The letter functions as a declaration of independence, a public severing of ties, and an accusation that challenged the theological justifications the Testament used for its atrocities. This kind of direct confrontation is psychologically significant. Many cult defectors leave quietly, too frightened or ashamed to articulate why. Val's letter represents a refusal to participate in the silence that protects abusive leaders. By naming Noth's actions as rape and murder rather than accepting the religious framing that justified them, Val was reclaiming language, asserting that her moral judgment mattered more than the prophet's interpretation. But here's where Val's psychology gets complicated. The heretic community Val built, while rejecting Noth's specific doctrines, replicated the cult structure in almost every other way. They still had a charismatic leader making authoritative pronouncements about divine will. They still isolated themselves from the broader community. They still used religious language to justify actions that would otherwise be recognized as violence. They still demanded absolute loyalty and framed dissent as spiritual failure. The heretics established themselves in the minds, creating a literal and symbolic underworld in opposition to Temple Gate's surface community. They covered themselves in mud and twigs, transforming their bodies into representations of their new theology. Where Kanath's followers wore simple homespun clothing, suggesting purity and separation from worldly corruption, the heretics embraced filth, darkness, and the aesthetic of the monstrous. This wasn't random costuming, it was theological embodiment. The heretics interpreted the entity in their dreams, the wall rider, though they didn't know that name, as their true god. Worknoth taught that this being was the Antichrist to be feared and resisted. Val taught that it was the genuine, divine, that the spider-eyed lamb represented liberation from false prophets. This inversion is psychologically revealing. Val didn't abandon the apocalyptic framework or the idea of spiritual warfare. Val just switched sides in the cosmic battle Noth had described. This pattern shows up repeatedly in cult defections that lead to new cult formations. The defector recognizes the current leader is corrupt but doesn't question the underlying structure that allows such corruption. Instead of rejecting authoritarian religious organization entirely, they recreate it with themselves in the leadership position, convinced they'll do it right this time, that their visions are genuine where the previous leaders were false, that their community will avoid the abuses they fled. Val's theology as leader of the heretics centered on several key inversions of Testament doctrine. Where Noth preached sexual purity and saw lust as sinful, Val embraced sexuality as sacred, leading rituals that included sexual assault framed as religious ecstasy. Where Noth demanded the killing of children to prevent the Antichrist's birth, Val sought to facilitate that birth, believing the entity they'd encountered in dreams wanted to incarnate through a suitable human vessel. Where Knoth taught separation from sin, Val taught integration with it. The heretics saw themselves as one with their God, a hive mind where human and divine merged without hierarchy or judgment. These inversions reveal Val's continued entanglement with the Testament's framework. Instead of developing an entirely new theology, Val created a mirror image of Noth's faith, everything reversed, but the structure intact. This is psychologically easier than genuine reconstruction because it allows Val to keep the cognitive architecture of religious certainty while simply flipping the content. The heretics' belief that their God was sinful and filthy and corrupt just as humans are represents a profound shift from Noth's theology of purity and separation. In this framework, divinity wasn't about transcending human weakness, but about embracing it, about recognizing that the sacred and profane aren't opposites, but interwoven. This could have been a radical move toward self-acceptance, toward rejecting the shame-based control mechanisms that define the Testament. But Val's community didn't use this theology to liberate its members from judgment. Instead, it created new forms of violation and control, just coded differently. The heretics still had hierarchies, still punished deviants, still demanded submission to Val's authority as prophet and leader. The content changed, but the mechanism of control remained the same: identity, gender, and the heretic's body. One of the most discussed aspects of Val's character is the ambiguity around gender presentation and identity. Val appears in the game wearing dresses associated with feminine presentation, yet documents from within the Testament consistently use male pronouns when referring to Val. Noth and his followers refuse to use female pronouns even when Val dresses in explicitly feminine clothing. When Blake encounters Val late in the game, covered only in mud, the body shown appears to have female anatomy, yet the character's presentation throughout remains complex and shifting. This ambiguity has generated significant fan discussion and multiple interpretations. Some players argue Val is a trans woman, whose identity is being deliberately denied by Noth's transphobic cult. Others suggest Val is intersex and that the Testament's rigid gender categories couldn't accommodate this reality. Some interpret Val as gender non-conforming or non-binary, deliberately presenting outside traditional categories as part of the heretic theology. Others point to theories that Val removed male genitalia in a ritual act, that the body shown late in the game is literally wearing another person's skin, or that the mud and lighting deliberately obscure anatomical details to maintain ambiguity. From a psychological perspective, what matters most isn't determining Val's true gender, but understanding how identity formation works under cult conditions and how Val's relationship to gender presentation connects to the broader themes of religious trauma and reconstruction of self. The Testament of the New Ezekiel, like many fundamentalist religious communities, would have enforced rigid gender roles as part of its theological framework. Men and women would have been assigned different functions, different expectations, different degrees of authority and autonomy. These categories wouldn't just be social conventions, they'd be treated as divinely ordained, essential to maintaining the community's spiritual purity. For someone whose body or identity didn't fit neatly into these categories, the Testament would have created unbearable pressure to conform. Gender ambiguity would have been read as spiritual failure, as evidence of demonic influence, as something requiring correction through prayer, punishment, or forced performance of the assigned role. If Val was assigned male at birth, but experienced gender dysphoria or desired to present as female, the Testament would have pathologized and punished these feelings. Noth's consistent refusal to acknowledge Val's feminine presentation even after the heretic split suggests this refusal is punitive. By insisting on male pronouns and calling Val male in documents, Noth denies Val the power to define their own identity. This is a form of ongoing control and invalidation, even though Val has left the Testament Noth continues to assert authority over the most basic question of who Val is. Val's choice to wear dresses and present femininely among the heretics then becomes an act of rebellion and self-determination. In the Testament, this presentation would have been forbidden, shameful, dangerous. Among the heretics, it becomes possible. This suggests that part of Val's motivation for creating the heretic community was the need for a space where authentic self-expression was possible, where the rigid categories that had constrained identity could be challenged. The heretic theology's embrace of the sinful and corrupt takes on new meaning in this context. If the Testament taught that Val's gender presentation or identity was sinful and corrupt, then Val's new theology reframes that supposed corruption as sacred. The body that was shamed becomes glorified. The desires that were condemned become holy. The self that was denied becomes the vehicle for divine incarnation. This reframing could have been liberating, a genuine move toward self-acceptance and the creation of community where marginalized identities found sanctuary. But the game makes clear that the heretics didn't build a sanctuary. They built another cage, just configured differently. Because while Val found freedom to present as desired, the heretic community replicated other forms of violence, the sexual assaults, the murders, the manipulation of vulnerable people. These weren't aberrations from heretic theology, but expressions of it. Val's journey toward authentic gender presentation got entangled with trauma responses, with the replication of abuse patterns, with the need for power and control that comes from having been powerless for so long. The psychological literature on cult survivors shows this pattern repeatedly. Leaving a cult doesn't automatically heal the damage it caused. The survival mechanisms developed under cult conditions, the distorted understandings of consent and autonomy, the normalized violence, all of these can persist even after physical escape. Val escaped the Testament's control but carried its psychological imprint, and that imprint shaped how the heretic community functioned. When Blake encounters Val in various states throughout the game, the shifting presentation, sometimes the dress and feminine styling, sometimes covered only in mud with anatomy partially visible, sometimes obscured by darkness and distance, mirrors the instability of identity formation under these conditions. Val is still constructing a self, still negotiating what it means to be who they are outside the rigid categories the Testament imposed. But that construction is happening in the midst of leading a violent cult, in the midst of pursuing the incarnation of an entity that may or may not exist, in the midst of psychological fragmentation that makes coherent identity nearly impossible. The ambiguity the game maintains around Val's gender isn't a failure of clarity, it's a representation of how cult trauma fractures identity itself. When your sense of self has been colonized by an authoritarian system, when your body has been a site of shame and control, when your desires and presentations have been punished into hiding, the process of reclaiming identity isn't smooth or simple. It's fragmented, contradictory, ongoing. Val is still becoming, still figuring out who Val is in the wreckage of what the Testament destroyed. The psychology of the heretic prophet Val's role as leader of the heretics reveals complex psychological dynamics around power, authority, and the perpetuation of abuse cycles. Having been subordinate to Knoth for years, Val now occupied the equivalent position in the heretic community, the one whose visions were authoritative, whose interpretations mattered most, whose word was law. This reversal from victim to authority figure is psychologically significant and often problematic. Research on abuse cycles shows that victims who gain power sometimes replicate the dynamics they experienced. not because they're inherently abusive, but because those are the only models of authority they know. Val learned leadership from Kanath, how to use religious language to justify violence, how to frame personal desires as divine will, how to demand submission in the name of salvation. These were the tools available, the templates for how a religious leader behaves. Creating something entirely different would have required resources Val didn't have: therapeutic intervention, exposure to alternative models of leadership, time and space to process trauma before assuming responsibility for others. Val got none of that. Instead, Val went directly from recognizing Noth's corruption to establishing a new community with Val at its center. The heretics looked to Val for guidance, for interpretation of their shared visions, for direction in how to serve their new god. And Val, still carrying the psychological imprint of the Testament's authoritarian structure, channeled that need for guidance into patterns that mirrored what Gnath had done. The heretic rituals involving sexual assault are particularly revealing of this dynamic. Val is described in documents as someone who wants a child and pursues this desire through violence against others. The game frames these acts as religious rituals within heretic theology, but psychologically they represent Val acting out scripts learned in the Testament while telling a different story about what those scripts mean. Noth was a rapist who used theological justification for his violations. Val witnessed this, was harmed by this system, explicitly named rape as one of the qualities she rejected in leaving the Testament. Yet Val then committed sexual violence while framing it as sacred union with the divine, as facilitating the birth of the Antichrist, as something qualitatively different from Noth's rapes because the theological meaning was inverted. This is cognitive distortion shaped by trauma. Val can't recognize the heretic community's sexual violence as equivalent to the Testaments because acknowledging that equivalence would mean admitting that leaving Noth didn't free Val from becoming like him. It would mean recognizing that the new theology Val created isn't liberating, but is another mechanism for the same violations. That recognition would destabilize Val's entire sense of purpose and moral justification. So instead, Val maintains the fiction of difference. Noth's rapes were violations of pure bodies by a corrupt prophet serving a false god. Val's sexual assaults are sacred acts facilitating divine incarnation in service of the true God. The framing changes, but the bodily violation, the lack of consent, the use of power to force submission, these remain identical. The psychological term for this is splitting, the division of self and others into all good and all bad categories, to avoid the anxiety that comes from recognizing ambiguity and moral complexity. Val split from Noth by casting him as entirely evil and the heretics as entirely righteous, even when the heretics engaged in the same behaviors Val had condemned. This kind of black and white thinking is common in people raised in cult environments because that's how cults teach their members to see the world. We are good, they are evil, there is no middle ground. Val's pursuit of facilitating the Antichrist's birth through Lynn, Blake's wife, reveals another layer of this psychology. The heretics believed Lynn carried the prophesied child, the incarnation of their God, and Val was determined to ensure that birth happened. This required hunting Blake and Lynn through Temple Gate, preventing Noth's followers from killing Lynn, and preparing to claim the child once delivered. This focus on a specific pregnant woman and her unborn child mirrors the Testament's obsession with childbirth and infanticide, just inverted. Noth killed children to prevent the Antichrist's arrival. Val sought to protect a specific child to facilitate divine incarnation. Both theologies placed enormous weight on controlling women's bodies and reproductive capacity. treating pregnancy and children as cosmic battlegrounds rather than human experiences. Val's desire for the child may have been partially driven by the trauma of having to kill the children Val once cared for. Having been forced to destroy lives Val had fostered and loved, perhaps Val's psychology latched onto the idea of protecting and claiming this one child as a form of redemption, a way of undoing the past by ensuring this child survived. But the method, violence, hunting, the terrifying pursuit through the mines, suggests this wasn't healthy parental instinct, but a traumatized compulsion wrapped in theological justification. The psychological concept of repetition compulsion helps explain this behavior. Traumatized individuals often unconsciously recreate aspects of their original trauma in an attempt to master it or resolve it differently. Val couldn't undo the children's deaths, couldn't save the sick kids from Noth's pragmatic cruelty, but Val could save this child, could defeat Noth in this cosmic battle over one infant's fate, and through that victory, perhaps, Val could feel like the past was redeemed. Except, redemption doesn't work that way. You can't heal trauma by perpetuating different violence. You can't undo the children you killed by terrorizing other people. And you can't become the good parent you wanted to be by hunting a pregnant woman through abandoned mines while covered in mud and leading a cult that commits sexual violence. But trauma logic isn't rational. It's the mind trying to process the unprocessable, to find meaning in senseless suffering, to construct narratives that make survival feel like more than just accidental continuation. Val needed the heretic theology to be true, needed the Walrider visions to be genuine divine communication, needed the Antichrist to be real and worth serving. Because if none of that was real, then Val had left the Testament only to create another nightmare, had abandoned Noth only to become another version of him, had rejected one false god only to serve another. The dreams and the Walrider. Throughout Val's psychological journey, the dreams remained central, the visions that started the cognitive opening, the shared experiences that united the heretics, the apparent communications from the entity they came to worship. Understanding these dreams requires looking at what the Walrider actually is within Outlast's broader mythology and what it means psychologically that Val and others interpreted this entity as divine. The Walrider was created through Murkoff Corporation's experiments at Mount Massive Asylum, a swarm of nanomachines controlled by a human host consciousness. It's not a demon or god, but a technological horror, though one that behaves in ways that blur the line between machine and supernatural entity. In Outlast 2, Murkoff's radio towers broadcast signals that induce hallucinations, psychosis, and what the corporation calls anticholinergic syndrome in Temple Gate's population. The dreams Val and other future heretics experience were likely a combination of these induced hallucinations and the psyche's attempt to process trauma. The Walrider itself, as a consciousness capable of distributing itself across nanomachine swarms, may have had some capacity to influence or communicate with people exposed to Murkoff's technology, though the game deliberately leaves this ambiguous. From Val's perspective inside Temple Gate, none of this technological context was available. Val experienced vivid dreams of a spider-eyed lamb, of being commanded or invited by an entity that felt more real and more compassionate than Noth's vengeful god. The psychological need to interpret these experiences as divine communication rather than induced psychosis is understandable. Humans have always sought meaning in altered states of consciousness, and for someone desperate to escape the Testament's framework, these dreams offered an alternative source of authority. But here's what makes this psychologically tragic. Val was being manipulated by forces she couldn't perceive, just as Noth manipulated his followers with claims of divine authority. Murkoff manipulated Temple, Gates' entire population through technological means that resembled divine communication enough to be mistaken for it. Val thought she was experiencing genuine mystical revelation when she was actually responding to stimuli designed to destabilize and control. This doesn't mean Val's interpretations were meaningless or that the psychological impact wasn't real. The dreams, regardless of their origin, created genuine cognitive opening. They genuinely connected Val to others having similar experiences. They genuinely provided the impetus for Val to question and eventually reject Noth's authority. But the entity Val came to worship wasn't the benevolent divine alternative to Noth's cruel god. It was another form of manipulation, another external force shaping Temple Gates' population for purposes that had nothing to do with their spiritual liberation. The Wall Rider, to whatever extent it possessed consciousness or agency, wanted a suitable host. Murkoff wanted data on how their technology affected isolated populations. Neither of these interests aligned with Val's actual well-being or spiritual growth. Val was being used, just as she'd been used by Noth, but the new user was invisible and incomprehensible within Val's theological framework. This creates a profound psychological tragedy at the heart of Val's story. Every step Val took toward what felt like freedom and self-determination was still a step within systems of control Val couldn't see. The rebellion was real, the suffering that motivated it was real, the desire for something better than the testament was real, but the solution Val found wasn't liberation. It was a different cage, and Val walked into it thinking it was sanctuary. The psychological literature on cult survivors often describes this pattern, leaving one high-control group only to join another, sometimes multiple times, before finally developing the tools to recognize these patterns and avoid them. Each iteration feels different, feels like this time it's real, this time the beliefs are genuine, this time the community won't betray you. But without the therapeutic intervention and sustained support needed to process cult trauma and rebuild healthy models of authority and community, survivors often recreate what they escaped. Val never got that intervention. Temple Gate was isolated. Murkoff ensured no outside help arrived, and Noth's violent response to the heretic schism meant Val and the followers were in immediate survival mode. There was no space for healing, no time for reflection, no access to resources that might have helped Val build something genuinely different. Instead, there was the desperate need to survive, to protect the community, to justify the choice to leave by making the new path meaningful. So Val doubled down on the heretic theology, committed more fully to serving the Wall Rider, pushed the community toward increasingly extreme expressions of their inverted faith. This escalation is common in cult dynamics. When outside pressure threatens the group, the response is often to become more insular, more extreme, more certain that the persecution proves they're right and everyone else is wrong. By the time Blake encounters Val in the mines, Val has been living this way for long enough that the heretic identity is solidified. Val isn't questioning whether the path was right anymore. Val has committed too much, sacrificed too much, become too many things that would be unbearable to recognize if they weren't sanctified by theological meaning. The only way forward is deeper into the belief system, more complete surrender to what the visions demand, more absolute certainty that the Antichrist must be born and Val's role is to ensure it happens. This is the psychology of sunk costs applied to identity itself. Val can't afford to question the heretic theology without unraveling the entire self that's been constructed around it. So instead, Any doubt gets reframed as spiritual testing. Any horror gets justified as necessary sacrifice. Any resemblance to Noth's methods gets explained away as superficial similarity, concealing fundamental difference. The human mind will go to extraordinary lengths to avoid recognizing that the story it tells about itself is wrong. Val's mind, already fractured by religious trauma and rebuilding under conditions of extreme stress and external manipulation, constructed a narrative where everything made sense, where Val was the prophet of liberation rather than another traumatized person perpetuating cycles of abuse while telling different stories about what those cycles meant, the final confrontation, and what it reveals. When Blake finally confronts Val in the mines near the end of Outlast 2, the encounter encapsulates everything Val's psychology has become. Val pursues Lynn with religious fervor, convinced that claiming the child is a sacred duty. Val speaks in the language of love and divine purpose while engaging in actions that are objectively violent and terrifying. Val has fully embodied the heretic prophet role, performing the identity that makes sense of all the suffering that led here. But there's a telling detail in how Val's story ends. During the pursuit, Val encounters Marta, Noth's enforcer, and the prophet's intimate companion since childhood. Marta was devoted to Noth with absolute loyalty, serving as the Testament's answer to the heretic's threat, the one sent to kill those who defected and maintain Noth's control through fear and violence. The dynamic between Val and Marta suggests rivalry, two people competing for position within the Testament's hierarchy, two interpretations of devotion to what each believed was divine will. The relationship between Val and Marta reveals the tragedy of the Testament's fractured community. These were people who had shared faith, shared experiences of Kanath's rule, who had both risen to positions of authority within the same oppressive system, but the schism forced them into opposition. Val became the heretic prophet seeking the Antichrist's birth. Marta became Noth's executioner, hunting those very heretics, and whatever complicated relationship existed between them was weaponized by their respective theologies. When Marta ultimately kills Val, there's a psychological resonance beyond just narrative convenience. Val is destroyed by someone who was shaped by the same system, someone who represents the path Val could have taken if the dreams had never come, if the cognitive opening had never happened. Marta remained loyal to Noth, internalized the Testament's doctrine so completely that she couldn't question even when commanded to commit atrocities. Val questioned and left, but still carried the Testament's imprint in how the heretic community functioned. Neither path led to liberation. Both Val and Marta ended up as instruments of violence. Both justified their actions through religious certainty. Both were shaped so profoundly by the Testament that they couldn't escape its psychological architecture, even when they physically separated from it. Val's death doesn't resolve the psychological questions their life raises. We don't get a moment of clarity where Val recognizes the patterns and breaks free. We don't see therapeutic redemption or healing. Instead, Val dies still committed to the heretic theology, still believing in the mission, still constructing meaning through the same frameworks that defined life under Noth's rule. This is perhaps the most honest psychological representation the game offers. Not everyone who leaves a cult heals. Not everyone who questions authority develops healthier models to replace it. Not everyone who rebels against abuse avoids perpetuating different abuses. Sometimes trauma wins. Sometimes the patterns are too deep, too formative, too entangled with identity itself to be escaped without resources and support that never arrive. Val's story is a tragedy, not because the rebellion was wrong, but because the rebellion was incomplete. Val questioned Gnoth, but not authoritarian religious structure itself. Val rejected the Testament's specific doctrines, but not the psychological mechanisms those doctrines employed. Val escaped Knath's control, but walked directly into Murkoff's manipulation and the heretic theology's demands, never finding actual autonomy or self-determination. The broader implications of Val's psychological journey illuminates several important themes about religious trauma, cult dynamics, and the difficulty of genuine liberation from totalizing belief systems. First, it shows how cult indoctrination shapes personality at such fundamental levels that leaving the physical community doesn't automatically free someone from the psychological structures it installed. Val carried the Testament's imprint in understanding of authority, in models of religious community, in the frameworks available for making meaning of suffering and purpose. Creating something genuinely different would have required not just physical separation, but extensive psychological work to identify and reconstruct those deep patterns. Second, it demonstrates how trauma responses can masquerade as religious experience. The dreams that catalyzed Val's defection were real experiences with powerful emotional content, and interpreting them as divine communication made sense within Val's existing framework. But those interpretations led to commitments and actions that perpetuated harm rather than creating healing. Not all intense spiritual experiences indicate genuine contact with the divine. Sometimes they indicate psychological distress, technological manipulation, or the mind's attempt to process unbearable reality by creating narratives that restore meaning. Third, Val's story shows the particular vulnerability of people in liminal authority positions within cults. As chief deacon, Val had enough proximity to power to see its mechanisms, but not enough autonomy to challenge it safely. This created cognitive dissonance that became unbearable once the dreams provided an alternative interpretive framework. But that same liminal positioning meant Val's model for how to lead came directly from Noth, creating the conditions for replicating authoritarian patterns in the heretic community. Fourth, the ambiguity around Val's gender identity and the Testament's refusal to acknowledge Val's presentation illustrates how cults control members through rigid categories and denial of self-determination. Val's move toward authentic gender expression was courageous and could have been liberating, but it got entangled with the heretic theology in ways that meant personal liberation and community violence became inseparable. The question this raises is haunting. Can authentic identity formation even happen under conditions of ongoing trauma and cult dynamics, or does the environment inevitably corrupt the process? Fifth, Val's pursuit of the Antichrist's birth reveals how unprocessed trauma shapes religious commitments. The children Val had been forced to kill created a psychological wound that found expression in the heretic mission. But rather than grieving those children and processing the horror of having harmed them, Val channeled that grief into cosmic significance, making this one child's survival the redemptive act that would justify everything. This is magical thinking born from unbearable guilt, the attempt to undo the past by controlling the future in ways that don't actually address the original harm. Finally, Val's story demonstrates the ethical complexity of assessing cult defectors who become leaders of new problematic groups. Val was a victim of Noth's abuse and the Testament's indoctrination. Val was also someone who committed sexual violence and led a community that perpetuated harm. Both things are true simultaneously, and recognizing both is necessary for understanding how abuse cycles perpetuate across generations and iterations of belief systems. In the real world, cult survivors who leave one group and form or join another face similar dynamics. The psychological needs that made the original cult attractive, the desire for certainty, for community, for meaning, for authority that seems benevolent, don't disappear just because you recognize that one particular group was harmful. Those needs persist and can drive survivors toward new groups that promise to meet them, even when those new groups employ similar high control tactics. Breaking this cycle requires access to resources that help survivors understand cult mechanics, develop internal authority rather than dependency on external leaders, process trauma in therapeutic settings, and rebuild models of community that respect autonomy and informed consent. Val had none of these resources. Templegate offered no therapeutic intervention, no outside perspectives, no support for processing trauma in healthy ways. So Val did what countless cult defectors do, found meaning in a new belief system that felt different enough to seem like liberation, while maintaining enough structural similarity to the old system that the transition felt possible. The heretic theology was psychologically accessible to someone formed by the Testament in a way that, say, secular humanism or non-hierarchical spiritual practice might not have been. It kept the apocalyptic framework, the spiritual warfare narrative, the sense of cosmic significance, the community structure. It just rearranged the pieces. Understanding Val's psychology doesn't excuse the harm Val caused, but it does explain how someone can simultaneously be a victim of religious abuse and a perpetrator of new forms of violence. This reality is uncomfortable because it resists simple moral categorization. It's easier to sort people into good survivors who overcome their trauma and bad abusers who hurt others. But real human psychology is messier than that binary allows. Val is what happens when a person shaped by cult trauma tries to build something better, using only the tools the cult provided. It's tragic and harmful and comprehensible all at once. Conclusion: Val's psychological profile reveals a person fractured by religious indoctrination, held together by theological frameworks that justified violence as sacred purpose, driven by unprocessed grief over children's deaths, and by visions that might have been mystical communication, or technological manipulation, or trauma responses, or all three. Val moved from chief deacon under an abusive prophet to heretic leader, replicating authoritarian patterns while believing this time was different. Val sought authentic self-expression through gender presentation, while simultaneously leading a community that violated others' autonomy. Val pursued what felt like liberation while walking deeper into systems of control that just looked different from the ones being escaped. The tragedy of Val's story isn't that questioning Noth was wrong. It was absolutely right to recognize the Testament's abuses and refuse to continue serving them. The tragedy is that Val never got the resources necessary to build something genuinely different, never had access to healing that could break the cycles rather than just rearranging them, never found the support that might have helped Val become the leader the heretics needed, rather than just becoming another version of what Noth had been. In the mines beneath Temple Gate, Val represented both the possibility of resistance to authoritarian religion and the danger of that resistance when it's not rooted in actual healing and healthy models of authority. Val's visions opened doors that needed opening, but what waited on the other side wasn't freedom. It was another cage, configured differently, but still a cage. And Val built it with absolute certainty that this time the walls were righteous. Understanding Val means sitting with that complexity, with the recognition that victims can become perpetrators without ceasing to be victims, that religious rebellion can replicate religious abuse, that the search for authentic identity under oppressive conditions rarely proceeds cleanly, that trauma reshapes personality in ways that persist long after the original abusive environment is escaped. Val deserved better than the Testament's indoctrination. The children Val cared for deserved better than being killed for Noth's theology. The heretics deserved leadership that didn't replicate the violence they fled. The people Val and the heretics harmed deserved safety and autonomy. These needs existed in tension with each other, and Val's psychological formation under cult conditions made it impossible to hold them all simultaneously. The psychological mechanisms that shaped Val, religious indoctrination, trauma responses, the replication of abuse patterns, the desperate need for meaning that makes surrender to new belief systems feel like liberation. These operate in the real world wherever cults exist. Val's story, for all its horror, game exaggeration, and apocalyptic framing, reflects real dynamics that destroy real lives. If there's anything to learn from Val's psychology, it's that liberation from cult control requires more than physical separation, and more than finding new beliefs to replace old ones. It requires therapeutic support, time to process trauma before assuming leadership of others, exposure to healthy models of authority and community, and the difficult work of identifying and dismantling the psychological structures that abuse installed at foundational levels of personality. Val never got that opportunity, and so Val's story ends in the mines, killed by someone shaped by the same system, having created a community that reproduced the violence it was meant to escape, still committed to visions that might have been nothing more than Murkoff's signals bouncing through traumatized minds desperate for meaning. Rest now, having understood one person's journey through religious trauma, defection, and the tragedy of replicating what you most wanted to escape. Val's psychology was shaped by forces beyond individual control: cult indoctrination, technological manipulation, the absence of resources for healing. What Val chose to do with those forces, the heretic community built, and the harm committed, those were choices shaped by a psychology that never had the chance to heal before being thrust into positions of authority over others. In the fog and mud of Temple Gate, Val searched for God and found Murkoff's signals. Val sought liberation and found new chains. Val tried to save the children by claiming one child, tried to become different from Noth while using his methods, tried to build authentic identity while leading a cult. The contradictions couldn't be reconciled, the trauma couldn't be outrun, and the story ended where it perhaps had to end: in violence, in the mines, in the wreckage of what happens when damaged people create new worlds using only broken blueprints.